Hi, and good afternoon to everyone. I am Ashley Watts, President and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to join us on this webinar. This is our second webinar in our Restart Kentucky webinar series. We had one on Tuesday dealing with public health officials and the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky, and the next one we wanted to do was on the economy. As we all know, our economy has been hit very hard by this pandemic. We just have to look at the unemployment insurance rate numbers that have gone up, the number our GDP has gone down, the number of businesses that have had to close either temporarily or permanently, and we know that it's going to take some time to kind of rebound from this. And a lot of discussion has been around how fast can we rebound. And I think we'll hear more in a minute, but I think from our perspective, we've never seen anything quite like this. People often talk about, is it similar to post 9/11? Is it similar to the post-recession? And unfortunately, we really can't compare because things have been so different in this pandemic and this new reality in which we're in. But I'm excited today to have a webinar focused on Kentucky's economy, where we were before, where we are now, and how possibly we can come out of this. And joining me today, I'm very excited to have Dr. Paul Coombs, who may be a familiar face to many of you all. He's an economist and has worked at U of L for many years and also in state government. He's also worked for the Chamber on several reports, and the latest one he did a couple years ago for us about how Kentucky's economy had bounced back from the recession. And it was a great report that we still use on a regular basis here at the Chamber. So he was the first person I called when I wanted to do a webinar about the economy in Kentucky and potential ways that we could rebound from this. And moderating today is our good friend, Mark Summer, partner at Frost Brown Todd, a great chamber member. Mark is also a board member of the Kentucky Chamber, and I joke that he is kind of my go-to tax guy. Any kind of tax questions I have on the policy side or otherwise, I always go to Mark first and foremost, because he just has that business mind, tax mind that we utilize here a lot at the Kentucky Chamber. So just for everyone who, if this is your first webinar, we are recording this. We do have a capacity to have 1,000 people on the webinar. I know sometimes we get full, and so after this is over, we will put the recording on our website, kychamber.com. We will also put it out through social media. And so if you do need a copy of the webinar, that's where they will be. And we'll make sure to push that out to anyone that needs it. I would also like to say a special thanks to our community and technical college system, KCTCS. They are our partner in this Restart Kentucky endeavor, specifically around the webinars that we're hosting. So we've had 2 this week. We will have 2 more next week. I'm excited. We're going to hear from hospital leaders from across the state about kind of what they are dealing with now, hospital capacity, when they're going to be back up and running. And then we also have one dealing with education efforts here in Kentucky. I think I told you all in the last webinar, I have a 4- and a 7-year-old at home. And so the thought of them not being in school for potentially 5 to 6 months, I think there are a lot of questions around that and kind of how we get back our workforce after all this is done. So those are the 2 webinars for next week, and we're planning some for the week after that we will send you information on soon. But any questions you have about these webinars, please let us know at the Chamber. You did have the ability to submit questions when you registered, and so Mark and Dr. Coombs will kind of go through those. Part of them will be part of the presentation, but you did have the ability. Our chat function, we don't know if it's necessarily working. We're in this new technology age where we kind of cross our fingers and hope everything works. So you can submit something through a chat button, but we're not sure if it's actually functioning properly today or not, but everything will be recorded, so please feel free to use this recording later on. And with that, I think I've kind of covered all of the housekeeping duties, and I will turn it over to Mark and Paul, and we'll have about an hour-long conversation, and then we'll hop off around 3 o'clock and kind of give some final thoughts and have this conversation last about 1 hour. So with that, I want to welcome Mark Summer and Dr. Paul Coombs, and I will turn it over to you all to hear all about Kentucky's economy and possibly how we can rebound from COVID-19.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate the opportunity to present to the Chamber. And certainly it's a great pleasure to be here with my good friend, Professor Coombs. Dr. Coombs and I think, have worked together in various stages for over 20 years, various capacities, the private sector, working on public sector projects, P3 type projects and the like. and there's no one that I'd rather hear from at this crisis moment about what we can do to rebuild the damage that has occurred because of the COVID pandemic. So with that, I'll ask Paul to start walking us through some of his empirical slides. Please try to chat your questions in, as Ashley indicated. We received hundreds of questions already, and we've worked those in on a topical basis as we progress through the slides. So with that said, Paul.
Hello, everyone. We've got to stop meeting like this. This is weird. I'm used to a room full of people with some body language. So I don't know, you're probably sitting in your pajamas making fun of me. That's fine. I'm going to try this technology now, and I'm going to shift to so you can see my screen, and then I'll come back on in a little bit with Mark, and he's got some really loaded questions for me. I've seen a preview, and I'm not looking forward to answering them. So let me see if I can get this. Here we go. Mm-hmm. And we should be seeing now sort of a PowerPoint. And I'm going to try to cover roughly 3 topics here. One, I'm going to start with the sort of public health policy and the most recent data, and just kind of try to make sense of it in a way that maybe you're not hearing on the news. Secondly, I'm going to take a quick look, or really a guesstimate, at how much economic damage has already been done and what's in the immediate pipeline, and speculate a little bit about what this means downstream with the supply chain and the chances of recession. And then third, I'm going to look at the government's policy response. And because Ashley got in touch about this, it forced me to look pretty carefully at the programs that the federal government has come up with as a response and try to make some estimates for Kentucky. I hope some of this information is valuable to you and your business. So let me just sort of frame it this way. As Ashley said, we've never had an economic situation like this. You can't go back in history and look at data to figure out what's going to happen this year, because we've never, at least in my lifetime, never had an economic contraction that was actually caused by public health policy. So we're definitely into an economic contraction caused by our public health policy. And that is leading, of course, to, it's really just now showing up in the last few weeks in the revenues to state and local governments in Kentucky. And also, I might add, it's also led to a very strong fiscal response by the federal government that we'll go into in more detail in a minute. So let me just summarize what I think we've learned in the past 5 or 6 weeks with the stay-at-home orders and all the closures. First, I think we all agree that social distancing has worked. The projections were much higher than it turned out. I think I joke that I think epidemiologists are trying to make economists look accurate, because I mean they have sort of over forecast or over projected the amount of deaths and cases by a factor of 4 and 5, particularly outside of New York City. And there's been no surge on hospitals in the Midwest that I'm aware of. Detroit a bit, but I don't think they ever hit capacity. As of this morning, the latest website from the CDC says Kentucky's had 185 deaths. People tend not to put this in perspective, so I looked up how many deaths we have in a typical month in Kentucky. It's over 3,800, so which is something like 125 deaths a day. So that put in perspective what we had, and it's much fewer than was forecast. I think we're finding, and we're going to increasingly find as the data are scrubbed, that much more than we thought of the deaths are coming out of nursing homes and other institutional settings like prisons. I think you'll see in a couple slides that in Kentucky, the curve is definitely flattened. I believe the new cases peaked about 12 days ago, in spite of the fact that we've increased testing many times over. As I think everybody understands, the extreme public health policy has led to very large economic and fiscal problems that are just starting to show up in the data. And as we'll get into towards the end, we're borrowing money, or the federal government is, which is the same thing as society, to pay people not to work. And we've never done this. It's not sustainable. And I understand how we got into it, but we've got to unpeel this as fast as we can because it's a recipe for a really bad recession. All right, so let me start off with something. It's always fun to poke fun at the media, but in this case, I think they deserve it. On Sunday, the Courier Journal had a front page article as they've been covering the COVID crisis, and they had these two charts that summarized the data. And I took one look at them and I thought, what? Daily deaths are not rising like that. I mean, I don't know what you see when you look at these two charts, but what I see is an exponential growth in this plague that's taken over everything. If you look at the data carefully, though, you realize that they weren't showing you daily data. They were showing you the cumulative. They were adding, compounding over time, all the deaths. So they're not helping people by scaring them with these exponential charts. I did write to them and ask for a correction, blah, blah, blah. I didn't hear anything. So let me show you what the data looked like, I think, in a more careful way to present. This is the number of newly diagnosed cases per day, and I smoothed it with a 3-day moving average so you don't get this weekend effect. And you can see that the highest number, 180, was almost 2 weeks ago. It went down, went back up again, it's down again in the last few days. If you convert that to growth rates, which is what the epidemiologists really look at, here you can see the great decline that we're seeing. So the percentage each day compared to what we had has been falling consistently now for several weeks. And this should give people some comfort that the worst is over. And then finally, deaths, which are still rising as a trend, as they will because they have a lag of about 2 weeks from the cases. But let's put this in perspective. If you look at the vertical axis there and see the scaling, the most we've had is an average there, a 3-day average of about 12 deaths. So keep in mind that we've had a total of 185 deaths, and Kentucky has over 3,800 deaths a month. So we've had an extreme public health policy measure in response really to something that was much more narrowly, the problem was much more narrow than the solution, at least in retrospect. And I'm not making a bad judgment on what we did 5 or 6 weeks ago, because then we had incredible uncertainty and fear based upon what we saw in China and what we saw in Italy. And I think, you know, the shutdown made great sense then. But particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think the data have gotten much cleaner. We found that the epidemiology forecasts were too high, and also that the problems are much more concentrated demographically and institutionally. And I think it calls for, and has called for several weeks, for a different kind of healthcare policy. Just one last example. In April 1st, the governor said that the best case scenario was we would have 1,300 deaths in Kentucky, could go as high as 3,200. As you just saw, we've only had 185. And I think the optimistic scenario will be off by a factor of 3 or 4. All right, let me leave that now and just turn to some economic consequences. This will be pretty broad brush. Most people, I think, already recognize everything I'm going to say, so I'll just kind of zoom through it. We know about the shutdown of retail and restaurants, travel, conventions, sporting events. Concerts have been postponed, Final Four, Kentucky Derby, you name it. The golf tournament, personal services, and we'll go through unemployment insurance in a second. We've had a pause with a lot of manufacturers. One big irony in all of this is that our hospitals have been laying off employees because they don't have any customers. They were basically shut down or closed off just for the COVID crisis. When we didn't have the COVID patients, They didn't have any other patients because there were no elective surgeries. We didn't have car accidents because people weren't traveling. And so hospitals have had big revenue problems and have had to lay people off. So have doctors' offices, outpatient surgery centers, dentist offices. You know the drill, you're all living this just like me. On the other hand, grocery stores are seeing phenomenal revenues. I think Kroger's was up 30% revenues year over year last month. Walmart's booming. Myers, places like that are booming. And they're trying to hire people. Same with trucking and delivery. And now I'll go into my guesstimate as to the magnitude of this. I'll just start with where we were. As Ashley said, I've been putting these charts together for years about growth since the last recession. You can see Kentucky here in the middle of the pack of surrounding states. And so we've added about 188,000 jobs since the trough of the last recession back in July of 2009, about 11%. So with that as a starting point, let's try to estimate what the current magnitude of the shutdown is in Kentucky. So I started with a model that has detailed estimates for 500 industries in Kentucky. I went through every industry and assigned a reduction, basically just common sense and news media reports and looking at published data on which industries were hit the hardest. Some obviously like full service restaurants. I think I assigned it a 80% shutdown rate, limited service restaurants, 20% shutdown rate, things like that. So I went through all of them and I end up with this, and I've ranked them by the most impacted. And so you can see the hardest hit in my simple calculations are food service. And then you can see the fourth one, retail trade. Go down about halfway, you'll see accommodations, some of the obvious things. And I get a total at the bottom there of about 588,000 total job losses to date based upon the public health policy, along with about 3.2 billion in compensation. That's over 2 months. That's not annual, it's over 2 months. Why is the employment impact greater than the compensation impact, 23% instead of 16%? That's because so many of the hardest hit industries are fairly low pay and tend to have more part-time workers. So food service, hospitality, a lot of retail have average pay in the 20 to 27,000 range instead of the state average, which is about 47,000. So there's my current estimate of what we've already programmed. I think it's going to be worse because we've not lifted the shutdown yet. And it looks like it's going to be a few more weeks, at least in Kentucky, maybe months. And at that point, I think it's going to cascade into a lot of other sectors of the economy. We'll talk about that at the end. Finally, last topic, let's look through the CARES impact, the big federal program with the $2-something trillion package that's come out over the last month. And there's really three pieces I'm going to focus on. One is unemployment insurance. I'm sure everybody knows that the federal government has decided to top up the state unemployment insurance program and add $600 per week to the state payout, which was only about $350 a week. If you apply that to the 20% of employees I think that have filed, you're up to $2.7 billion that's going to flow into Kentucky paychecks or households in the next 2 months. The Paycheck Protection Program, the first wave is about $350 billion. There's a nice website that I think it's the Treasury Department has, that shows the payouts by state to businesses. And Kentucky actually got 1.2% of the loan dollars, which is actually slightly higher than our payroll base. So we did okay in the first round. And if you assume that for the second round, which is, I guess, hasn't got through Congress yet, that would be another $8 billion flowing in over 2 months. Some of that would have to be repaid. Mark knows more about this than me, and maybe we'll get him to make some comments about because he's dealing with this for a lot of his clients. And then finally, the household stimulus payments. The IRS is giving, as you know, payments to households starting at $1,200 for a single household, up to $3,400 for a married couple with 2 or more kids. I've made an estimate using IRS data on filers that amounts to about $3.9 billion. So if you add those 3 things up, you can see that the federal government has programmed over $14 billion coming into Kentucky this month and next month. Just to put it into perspective, Kentucky has about $20 billion in employee compensation in 2 months, of which we've already lost about $3.2 billion. So it's give you something to compare it to. All right, let's just go into a little bit of detail on each one, and then I'll stop and let Mark ask me some hard questions. You're probably aware of this incredible spike in unemployment insurance claims. When Ashley said this is unprecedented, take a look at this chart. You can see that the last recession and the run-up in claims over that 18-month period was, unprecedented at that time. It's nothing like what we're seeing now. It looks like it got up to maybe 25 to 30,000 claims in 1 week at its peak. We're up to over 100,000 a week for the last month. So you can see the spike on the right. Compare that to our coronavirus cases. This was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, so I did a screenshot because I wanted to share it with you. This is fascinating. The bottom axis there shows you the number of coronavirus cases by state divided by the population. And you can see Kentucky is almost the lowest of any state as far as the prevalence of the disease. The vertical axis shows you the number of unemployment insurance claims divided by, I think it's the share of the labor force. Kentucky's almost the highest of any state. So that is just a striking contrast. We've had very little disease, but we've had almost the highest rate of unemployment insurance claims of any state. I think I've been trying to figure out why that's true. I think it's partly true because we have a relatively low percentage of professional and high-end service jobs in Kentucky. We're still a manufacturing, retail, distribution-based economy, more manual things where people can't work at home as easily. So that would explain why, for example, California or Washington State would have lower claims. You can see New York over there has half the rate of unemployment insurance claims as Kentucky. Of course, that doesn't explain why we're higher than, say, South Dakota. So go figure. So here's a summary of this. We have a public policy now that is paying people not to work. Never before. I'm guessing that maybe 20% of employees have already filed in Kentucky. Think about this. The state pays about $350 a week on average in unemployment insurance. The federal government is topping that up by $600. So now you're talking about $950 a week. This is higher than the average pay of most of the people that are working in these impacted industries. People are going to have a real disincentive to go back to work, even if their business is open. The amount of money that we're going to pay out just out of the state fund, assuming 12 weeks of benefits like that, is about $1.6 billion. I checked our fund balance back from January, February. It only had $619 million in it. So obviously, the Kentucky Unemployment Trust Fund is going to have to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, federal government, which is what it's allowed to do. But it will have to pay the money back unless they get some sort of forgiveness. And that will mean that unemployment insurance premiums on your businesses per employee are going to go up. And they will probably double over the next few years to pay this money back. I also noticed that they are not experience rating employers by their type of industry and their insurance claims. Because this is a national emergency and a healthcare emergency, the cost of this will be spread over all employers, not just those that laid people off. And then finally, the supplemental money from the federal government under those assumptions, 12 weeks, $600 federal amount, and 20% of employees will generate about $2.7 billion into workers' pockets over the next 2 to 3 months. This is just a slide showing you the bump that you're likely to see in the payouts from Kentucky Unemployment Insurance Fund. All right, I got 2 quick slides on Paycheck Protection Program, and we'll move to the end. This is in the on the Treasury's website. I pulled it down yesterday. There's been a lot of sort of commentary that a few big companies sucked all the money. That's not what the data look like. You can see that by far the biggest recipient were in this smaller class of $150,000 loan value. Almost 3/4 of the loans went to fairly small loans, $150,000 or less. It is true that the larger borrowers did borrow a lot more money. That's the bar on the right is much bigger than their share of the number of loans because they got larger loans. And you can see Kentucky received about $4.1 billion of this in the first round, which is about 1.2% of the national total, which was pretty respectable. All right, the last topic is the household payments that the IRS is making now, either direct deposit or they're going to send paper checks to people that didn't file electronically. There's about $300 billion that have been authorized for this based upon your income tax filings in 2018, 19, and your household composition. I stole this chart from the Tax Foundation. It's a nice way to summarize how they've layered this depending upon the demographics of your household. And so you can see at the bottom, if you're single with no children, it's $1,200. If you're married with 2 children, it's $3,400. So I made an estimate of how much this will generate for Kentucky households. We're about 1.3% of households in that income bracket. So we should be receiving about $3.9 billion this month and next month in deposits and checks. So that's the amount of federal money flowing in to Kentucky. I think it's still an open question what Kentucky households will do with this money. Right now, they really can't travel, and a lot of people don't want to travel. They don't want to get on airplanes. They don't want to stay in hotels. They don't want to go to sporting events and concerts. I have a sneaking suspicion there's going to be a lot of home remodeling done over the next year. People are spending more time in their homes than they ever have, and they're realizing, you know, it's getting a little dingy, and we need to remodel our kitchen and our bathroom and repaint and paint our outside of our house and get new windows, and that would be a great use of one-time money. But there is an academic literature showing that over the decades, whenever there's been a one-time grant of federal money to households, that people tend to save it more than they typically do with regular income, because they consider it a one-time shot as opposed to a permanent increase in their income. And so they will use it to either add to their savings or, in probably more cases, to pay down debts, to pay off credit cards, to pay off cars, to make an extra payment on their mortgage. So if that happens, it's not really going to stimulate the economy to the extent it would if they were remodeling their homes and buying a lot of local goods. But I would expect a big surge in demand for people that remodel homes and all that goes with it, all the trades, the plumbers, the electricians, the carpenters, the heating and air conditioning system people, because people are going to have money in their pockets and less possibilities of where to spend it. So this is, let me just end here. You know, as Ashley said, nobody really knows where we're heading here in the next few months. I see it as kind of a scale. On the left side, we have all the negative pressures because of the closures. We have a looming national recession. And every week that goes on, I think it becomes a higher and higher probability of significant recession. On the other hand, you have this $14.5 billion that the federal government is shoveling into Kentucky. My sense is, as you can probably tell, the $14.5 billion would have probably got us through an economic pause if it had only lasted 4 weeks or 6 weeks. But as it goes into 2 months and 3 months, I don't see how we can correct the tilt downward of the supply chain effects. The things like, for example, the airline industry, I think, is running at 10% of capacity. Hotels are probably at 10 or 20% capacity. Travel's down everywhere. As you know, the oil industry's in the tank because not only is there a huge surplus of oil, nobody's traveling anywhere, so there's no demand. So that's killing that sector. And there's just ripple effects from what we see at the retail level with restaurants and hotels and airlines and so on to everything behind that. Their suppliers, the manufacturers, the raw materials people. And once that cascades, it's really hard to stop, you know, until the excesses just go through the system. And that's typically, you know, what we call a recession. So Mark, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to turn my slides off and go back to my face. And I think I just did.
There we go. Thank you, Paul. Ready for some questions?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. A lot of questions have been coming in. And so I want to start off, Paul, right where you were at the end, which was the significant inflow of federal money, not just into Kentucky, but into the country as a whole. So in the last 4 or 5 weeks, I'll round a little bit, the Congress has appropriated $2.1 trillion. They have another $484 billion appropriation pending today. Let's round that to $2.6 trillion over a 4 or 5 week period. The US budget, annual budget, is roughly $4 trillion. And as a point of comparison, in February of this year, President Trump offered his version of a budget, and his largest single area of expenditure was for defense in terms of one cost center, and that was $705 billion. So let's talk about different schools of economic thought, because we've seen 2 of the 3 already, right? One would be flushing money into the system. We've seen that. 2 would be cutting taxes, and we have seen that, albeit not by rate, but by administrative adjustment. And then the third economic tool, I think, that most on the call would recognize is infrastructure spending or stimulus spending, akin to the major program that rolled out by the Obama administration in 08-09. So out of all 3 of these, how do you rank them in terms of importance to the economy and stabilizing or growing the economy?
Well, Mark, I'm real old-fashioned about this, and I have sort of 30 or 40 years of basic economic principles ingrained in me. And what I was taught and what I taught was the federal government should run surpluses during economic booms, and it should run deficits during economic recessions. Of course, we have not done that since Bill Clinton's last 2 years. So it's been a long time since we've run a surplus, even though we've had 2 strong booms. The other reason for the federal government to incur debt would be a national emergency like we have now. So that's a legitimate use. A plague like we basically have now, or a war, or an infrastructure plan that's an investment that pays back for decades, like the interstate highway system. So I'm just giving you classical economics. That's what we were taught, and that's what we teach. Those are the valid reasons. Unfortunately, for now almost 25 years, the federal government has been running deficits, and we're at the point now where it's the highest ratio to GDP since World War II for none of those reasons. We haven't done infrastructure spending. The Obama thing, shovel ready, never really occurred. The money went into paychecks. We didn't do infrastructure spending. There's a tendency for Republicans to spend money on the military, particularly military pay, and give raises there. And in the case of George Bush, W. Bush, on 2 wars, neither of which he asked the American people to pay for through taxes. So in the case of both the military pay increases and the wars, there was no tax increase to pay for those. It was just all debt without any votes, really. Democrats, on the other hand, tend to like to spend money on social programs, more government programs, pay for government workers. And again, they don't put tax increases in because they're politically unpopular, and no one thinks they can win an election if they promise tax increases. So it's a really unfortunate position we're in now, where we've basically used generations worth of our credit worthiness, and the fact that everybody in the world wants to park their money in US treasuries, and we can borrow money at 1% or less. And so we're financing government, basically a helicopter drop, as you point out, of trillions of dollars that we don't have. I hope people, and I think the business community type people understand business and economics, and they know that the federal government really doesn't have this money. But a lot of other people don't understand that. For example, I know the city government of Louisville now has a $70 million rainy day fund, which they're probably going to have to tap into this year. It's real. They have to balance their budget. State government has a rainy day fund. I don't know how much is in it, but again, they have to balance their budget. The federal government has gotten in a situation where they don't even think about balancing the budget and just keep spending money that they don't have because they can borrow it so easily. I just think it's really unfortunate. And I think it also just put aside the macroeconomic theory and consequences of it, even if you can get away with it. I don't think it's a good policy culturally. Here I am talking without a license, but I don't think it's a good thing for our country to believe that we can have anything we want without paying for it. We're borrowing trillions of dollars against future tax revenues to consume now. And it's just really bad, I think, for society to do that. I'm not sure if it was a long answer and probably a rambling one, but you touched a nerve with me.
Well, then I'm doing my job according to leadership, right? Speaking of the debt, I checked yesterday at 3:40 Eastern Time, and the U.S. debt as published was $24,485 billion.
Right.
That's the published version, and the unfunded mandate unpublished version, which purportedly accounts for Social Security mandate, Medicare mandate, effectively contracts that have already been awarded vis-a-vis to the people, but yet paid out, is $123 trillion as of, as I said, late yesterday afternoon. But that's all macro. Let's talk micro just for a moment if we could. So Kentucky, you and I have been doing this a long time, and we remember the 08 and the 09 meltdown. And a lot of that was housing centric. or driven, maybe that was the tipping point, better way to say it. And we lived through it in Kentucky. And it was nowhere near as bad in our part of the United States as it was in the various coastlines, whether that be Florida, the West Coast, or the Eastern Seaboard. And consequently, the damage because of the recession wasn't as severe. And the reason was is the run-up leading to the recession was not as steep. So let's assume we're going to have that same dynamic here, that we're always a little bit behind the curve, both good and bad. We don't grow as fast, but we don't fall as fast. On a micro level, what do you see the immediate consequences to the Kentucky economy being because of the COVID as modified by the federal relief?
So I agree with you totally, what you said about the last recession. You know, it was a housing finance type recession, and it really hit places that had bubbly housing markets. Obviously, Kentucky, Louisville, Lexington, our other major cities did not have housing bubbles, and so didn't have to go through it. We were just pulled into a national recession. Now, going forward, I think now you're talking about trends in economic development. I don't think that this will change the trend much, our position relative to other places. We still have the same fundamental challenges here where, and I've been giving this speech for 30 years, Kentucky did not really participate in the boom in high-end professional jobs over the past 25 to 30 years. That's where most of the growth has occurred nationally in those industries like yours and mine, by the way, and probably most of the people listening. We disproportionately still rely upon manufacturing, distribution, and lower wage things that don't require a lot of formal education and don't pay near as much. That's still our economic development challenge here, and it will go forward. So we'll probably still continue to underperform in terms of professional job growth, in terms of average pay, our per capita personal income, those kind of measures. They haven't gotten better since the 1950s in Kentucky relative to other states. So until we change the way we do things in this state, we're not going to get different answers as far as the economic statistics. We're going to still be not as bad as West Virginia, not as bad as Mississippi, but down there in the bottom 5 in almost every economic and human capital measure.
Good, thank you.
Mark?
Let's pivot back to the federal for one moment. The Fed and the Treasury came in very, very hard, very quickly, and it was almost unprecedented, if not unprecedented. I say almost because they're not finished yet, or at least we think they're not finished, in scope, in scale, and speed. Do you have an opinion as to why Treasury and the Fed moved in so hard, so fast, as compared to 08, 09, going all the way back to the recession of July 1990? I think this is my fourth recession. This will be my fifth recession as a professional. And I guess it's the old adage, if you practice long or work long enough, you see it all. So any indicators from your perspective why they did what they did so quickly?
You know, that's really not my specialty. As I was watching this unfold every night and watch the federal government react, I saw panic and fear in the eyes of a lot of New Yorker type people that are in the Trump administration who went through the meltdown in 2008 and 9 and saw the banks go under, and they didn't want to go through that sort of meltdown again. So I think their first impulse was liquidity. So they just did anything they could, particularly through the Federal Reserve, to pump money into the economy so there would not be a panic and a run. that's my take. Unfortunately, now we've got the Federal Reserve doing fiscal policy, where the Treasury is issuing debt out the wazoo. At the same time, the Federal Reserve is just buying the treasuries and the federal debt. We used to call that monetizing the debt, and in textbooks, it always leads to inflation. The problem with that, they did it in 2007 and 8, and we didn't see any inflation to speak of. So I guess we'll have to revise our macroeconomic textbooks to explain it. One theory is it's because of the globalization of the economy, and so much work has been done offshore by lower cost labor, which has allowed inflation to be at bay. But anyway, I'm really a regional economist, so I'm just speculating here. It's not really my area of expertise.
Well, don't sell yourself short, Professor. Let's talk about something that I know you have a passion for, and that's, as you indicated earlier, you're more old school than new school in your thought about government-focused economics. Let's talk about taxes, in particular, how they grow, stabilize, or hinder economic activity. And I'll reference one of the leading economists and certainly economic minds over the last 40 years. That's Art Laffer, economics icon, a conservative economic lion of the Laffer curve fame. Dr. Laffer, as recently as last Sunday, I think, or last Saturday in the Wall Street, has been emphasizing a payroll tax cut. He'll call it maybe a payroll tax holiday. And just for the viewers, while the CARES Act indicated, offered rather, several payroll tax related criteria incentives. So some credits, some subsidies, some deferrals. Dr. Laffer is proposing an out and out exemption. In other words, the 15% payroll tax, roughly calculated, that is incurred on every dollar of wage paid in the United States. He is encouraging that lapse or be zeroed out through December 31, 2020. How does this impact, this kind of an effort impact Kentucky's recovery? In other words, if we cut taxes in that regard, is that the way to stimulate and bring Kentucky out of this, among other states?
I agree with Art on this. He's been nice enough to include me on his conference calls for the last month, and he's having 3 or 4 a week, and often with Steve Forbes, Steve Moore, and then they have guests. And from the very beginning, a month ago, Art has been pushing the payroll tax suspension through the end of the year in lieu of what President Trump and Congress have done. And he has very good reasons for it, as you summarized. There's several benefits. If you suspend the payroll tax withholding, employers immediately get a cash flow benefit of 7.65% of their wages and salaries that they don't have to send to the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. So they all of a sudden have cash that they wouldn't have had throughout the end of the year. It also makes labor cheaper to them. They're more likely to hire people because the cost of labor just went down. The third benefit is the employees get a 7.65% increase in their take-home pay, which gives them more incentive to work, and more take-home pay. So compare that to this unemployment insurance supplement program that we've got, where the federal government is giving people an extra $600 a week not to work. So that's economic suicide, to pay people not to work, particularly to give them a higher pay than they would get if they were working. Or compare it to the IRS $2,400 a household for a household of 2. That is a really crude instrument. It's going out to households whether they need the money or not, whether they're retired, whether they're workers, whether they want to work. Totally wrong incentives and very inefficient, blunt way to do things. So I thought Art was out of the box on this from the beginning, but he couldn't get anybody to listen to him. And I guess he just published that thing in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was last weekend, he and Steve Forbes. And I guess he just got appointed to Trump's panel, but it's too late. They've already spent the 2-something trillion by Congress and the president, and they're loading more in there. So if they do this on top of it, it's even more of a hole in our federal debt. So I wish they'd have listened to him a month ago.
So with your last comment, I mean, do I take it that you don't foresee any tax increase coming up? Whether that's at the state or local level or the federal level? In other words, you know, that would be damaging. While a tax cut today would be helpful, they can't afford it. You know, the next best thing would be status quo.
I think it's different at each level of government. The federal government, I think no way the federal government is going to have a tax increase with Trump as president and a Republican-led Senate. They'll just keep running debts. This is just Coombs's forecast here. They'll just keep running debts. If the Democrats win the Senate and the presidency in November, yeah, they're going to try to raise taxes. They'll also probably raise spending. So I don't know if it'll help the debt or not, but they would definitely try to raise taxes on rich people, on wealthy people, and which usually means on middle-class people when it's all said and done. At the state level, you have a governor who was basically elected by the teachers union. They would like to have, they always want pay increases, and they want juicy pensions and defined benefit pensions and health insurance coverage. And so he would probably like to increase taxes so that he could give them more money. But you have a General Assembly that's run by Republicans. They tend to like public schools. They're not against those, and they tend to put money there, but they're against tax increases. And they've also been pretty lukewarm on pension reforms. So you got to get mixed messages there. You go to the local level, I know Louisville better than any place. I just read this morning that Jefferson County Public Schools is probably going to raise property taxes this fall, which is ironic given that they've not been holding classes for 2 months or a month. They're going to have a hard time selling it to the voters, although, as you know, they don't have to have a vote on it as long as they only raise it by a few percentage points. So I suspect that's going to happen. In the case of the mayor of Louisville, he's been pushing for a local option sales tax now since his first term, and he's in his third term. And I agree with him. I think it'd be a lovely tool to have in the toolbox and allow city governments, county governments, the ability to use a consumption-based tax instead of an income-based tax. I think it's almost 60% of the city of Louisville's general fund comes from the employee withholding, the payroll tax, plus the net profits tax. So every place in Kentucky, the city governments, county governments are very dependent upon occupational taxes and net profits taxes, which most economists will tell you provides the wrong incentives for economic growth. So maybe this will finally goad the legislature into finally allowing this to go on the ballot so that people can vote, because we need a referendum to pass, because currently it's unconstitutional to have a general local sales tax, like Tennessee does, by the way. And by the way, I don't know if people know this, but the mayor of Tennessee, they rely heavily on a sales tax. It's about 10% there. He's now proposing a big increase in their property tax because their retail sales tax revenues are down so severely. So it's a mess.
Let's take a couple questions from some of the viewers. What do you believe, Paul, are the 1 or 2 biggest impediments that keep Kentucky from moving away from manufacturing and distribution jobs, from moving away from those traditional sectors to more high-paying professional and/or service jobs, including tech jobs?
Well, we certainly don't want to lose our manufacturing base and the distribution things. Those are fantastic. I think we'll always have a great advantage on those because of our central location and our transportation nexus. So I'm not demeaning those jobs. They're fantastic.
I'm not demeaning those jobs. They're
But
fantastic.
we've really had a problem
We've really
higher
had a
end
problem
professional jobs. And
hiring
we've
professional
kind of become, in the case of Louisville, a third tier city where, you know, we no longer compete obviously with Chicago's or Atlanta's, but we're having a hard time competing with Indianapolis and Nashville and Cincinnati. Limited air service. We don't get the corporate headquarters we used to get. So that's a really tough question. You know, I don't know the answer. We've had generations now a redistributionist culture in Kentucky, where we take, a friend of mine used to say, if Kentucky found a nickel, they'd divide it by 120 counties. And, you know, that's partly our generosity and it's partly the legacy of our farming legacy. But the price you pay for that is you don't have a really vibrant urban economy. And that's where most of the growth has been occurring in the United States in the past 20 or 30 years, are in the big cities. And we're stable, but we're not booming. And most of our listeners, I'm sure, go to Nashville occasionally. I go down there 2 or 3 times a year. What a contrast to Louisville. Just the booming, the young people, the professional jobs. And they have much more of a pro-growth culture and more of a local, self-dependent, self-reliant culture, not looking to state government to spread it an inch thin. Coombs' opinion.
That's why you're here, Professor. Another question from the viewers. What's the impact, if any, on education in Kentucky, specifically because of the COVID pandemic? You mentioned the previously announced real property tax increase for Jefferson County that was in the newspaper this morning. It's been in the media for the last several months. That's an economic issue. Your favorite institution, the University of Louisville, has recently announced tens of millions of dollars of fiscal changes, both at the academic side and the non-academic side. The University of Kentucky, the state's flagship university and namesake university, similar type adjustments, although different numbers because of different scale. Take that on down from the highest level of higher ed to the lowest level. We haven't had school for 6 weeks in Kentucky. The governor came out on Monday, effectively closing schools for the rest of the year. This has to have some economic impact, either near term or midterm or long term. You have any thoughts on that?
Mark, that's a deep one. There's a lot of speculation going, and we're all thinking about how this may change education forever, just like it's changing meetings forever. Teachers might be surprised that a lot of kids come back from home smarter than when they left. They're spending so much time with smart people like you in the household and learning from their very savvy parents. So I hope that may be a challenge to the school systems. But so far, I don't see that they're being touched financially. Everybody in the school system is being paid. You're right, the universities are having some furloughs and some budget cuts, but they've had a really good run for the last 30 years, the universities have, not with public support, but with tuition increases. And it's been almost dollar for dollar, the increase in tuition for the reduction in public support. And I was in that system for 30 years, and I can tell you, faculty and staff did very well. So this is going to be a tough bump in the road, but I think they're in a good position to handle it.
Good, thank you. Let me toss one more question out, if I could, and then we'll bring Ashley back in. So Monday morning quarterbacking, which is inevitable in our country. What could we have done better over the last 2 months? Not from a public health perspective. Obviously, we're not public health professionals, but from an empirical or economic perspective. Example, rather than the Fed and the Treasury flushing money in order to stimulate liquidity or maintain liquidity. Let's assume they didn't do that, and President Trump and the Congress were able to agree on a $2 trillion, $3 trillion 5-year spending plan, shovel ready. With the benefit of hindsight now, and it'll be more crystal clear hindsight in 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months, what could we have done different, if anything?
Well, Mark, if it was a long-term problem, I would agree that infrastructure would be better than the kind of relief and stimulus we're having now. But because there was so much uncertainty and the economy just went off a cliff. Usually in recessions, we kind of slide into them and they last about a year and then you slide out. This all happened in a matter of weeks. So if you'd had an infrastructure plan, there's no way they could have gotten the money out and used it effectively, building bridges and roads or whatever you want to rebuild. It would take years to do these things. Even if you cut all the regulations and the red tape out, you got to do the contracting and you got to find people to do the work. So I understand why they had to do something instantaneously. But to me, the one thing that I think we're learning now in retrospect, and this is no judgment on the initial decision, is that about a month into it, I'd say around Easter, I think it became clear to everybody that the problem was not as big, the public health problem was not as big as forecast, and that we were not going to have a hospital surge outside of New York City, and even there it was handled well. So even with social distancing, the models over-projected the amount of deaths and cases. I think at that point, if public health policy and federal fiscal policy had pivoted quickly, and we could have just had an economic pause instead of, I think, the recession that we're about to have. Because I think we're a rich enough country and businesses are flexible enough that we could have handled a 1 month pause. I really do. But a 2 month pause and a 2.5 and 3 month pause, I don't see how we can resist a recession. And I hope I'm wrong, but in my gut and all my training tells me that we're in for a downturn here, and it's already started.
Ashley?
Great, thank you. Gosh, that was great information. Thanks to both Mark and Paul. Just when I've been sitting here listening, I've gotten lots of emails and texts from people saying how informative this was and how much they're enjoying it and asking when it's going to be available to share. So thank you all. Paul, I think you made some great points. One, I definitely have bought more on Wayfair and Amazon lately because I've never spent this much time in my house. So I had to have a new dining room chair and new pillows and all of that kind of stuff. So your point for me is exactly right. I don't know about your point of kids being smarter after the end of this. I have realized I am not great at 2nd grade math. And so we'll see if my kids are smarter at when they come out of this, hopefully so. But thank you all so much. We will make this available. We have gotten lots of questions about it. So Paul, if it's okay, we'll make this available and your presentation. We'll email all the participants, but it'll also be on our website, kychamber.com. We'll push it out through social media, but I think it's been really great information that has needed to be talked about. And so thank you, Mark and Paul, especially Paul, for putting this presentation together with about a week's notice after I asked you. So this has been really excellent. I appreciate it. I know the business community listening appreciates it. And stay safe. And everyone, check out our webinars next week. We have 2 dealing with hospital administrators. Now hospitals are dealing with the coronavirus. And then also one on the state of education with our education commissioner and others in higher ed, the Pritchard Committee, et cetera. So stay tuned for next week's webinars. And thank you again to Mark and Paul, and stay safe, and please let us know if you need anything. Have a great day.